Hello, and welcome to my perpetual state of confusion. Today I would like to talk about, I actually don't know exactly how to phrase this, and I've been thinking about it for months, but I had been, and spoilers, I'm going to be spoiling like a lot of movies. Insidious Chapter 2, followed by Deadly Blessing, and then maybe like 2 weeks later I saw Soapdish and noticed they all had kind of a similar thing they did. And I'm going to call it the horror gender reveal, although some of these movies will not be horror films. But this is essentially, the trans-coded or gender non-conforming guy in drag, man in a dress, horror movie for the most part, gender reveal. Think Sleepaway Camp, Psycho. I will be talking a lot about Sleepaway Camp and Psycho. I will probably also be pulling a lot of quotes. I wrote a 24-page document of which I will be looking down at a lot because, again, quotes. So if that's something that bothers you, this is not the video for you. I'm not here to necessarily put an indictment on these movies or on anyone for liking them. I like a lot of these movies myself, but I do think it's important to talk about, especially since like Insidious Chapter 2 came out 10 years ago. So this is not something that's even finished. I will also probably be mentioning a couple other issues that go along with these things. Considering this was not actually started with Psycho, we will be going further back than that. But, we have over 60 years worth of information, and our terminology has really changed a lot throughout that time. I will try to be using as much as possible modern technology. Modern vocabulary. I'll be using modern terminology to describe these things, but keep in mind some of these movies may have used outdated vocabulary, and some of them, when watching, I think maybe they misunderstood and conflated, and I'm not sure if that was the film, but I get the sense that's just the times, like there was a conflation between, words I'm gonna explain actually, gender expression, gender identity, and sexuality. A man in a dress was a code for something. I'll also be talking about queer coding and all that in just a moment. But let's look at some more queer terminology first. We have gender expression, and that's how you dress. That's, how the length of your hair. That's, are you wearing, what you're wearing, how you look. That's your gender expression. In the United States, as well as pretty much the world, we have a certain standard for how we expect men to dress and for women to dress. And I'll talk more about the restrictions and guidelines in terms of our gender roles in dress a little bit later on, but that's what gender expression is. It's how you look, how you present yourself, how you choose to present yourself. Then there's gender identity, and that is how you identify. In most Western culture, it's typically man, woman, gender non-conforming, non-binary, stuff like that. Gender fluid. Okay. Oh, well, I guess gender identity also would be cis and trans. But again, that's how you identify. Anyway, going forward. Sexuality. That gay, straight, bi, pan. That's who you love. Okay? Or attracted to. Stuff like that. Words I'll probably be using would be queer is the term that I probably use most often when describing the LGBTQ plus community. Just looking at the wiki, it's denoting or relating to a sexual identity that does not correspond to established ideas of sexuality, especially heterosexual norms. I think I use it most often to describe someone who's gay, but trans as well does fit into the umbrella term of queer. Transgender, again, going for the wiki definition, denoting or relating to a person whose gender identity does not correspond to the sex assigned to them at birth. So I was assigned female at birth, AFAB. If I identified as a man, I do not, but if I did, then I would be trans, as an example. And vice versa. If someone who is assigned male at birth and identifies as a woman, then they would be trans. A lot of people use trans as an umbrella term, and they would consider non-binary, gender fluid, or anyone else who's gender non-conforming as trans as well, though some people do not use that term trans to describe other people who are gender non-conforming. So I am going to use them separately. Gender non-conforming compared to trans. That way we don't get as confused going forward, because when we talk about someone who I'm kind of unsure of, I'll probably just use gender nonconforming and they, them terminology. Whereas someone I'm more specifically sure of, like Norman Bates, he, him, cisgender. Okay. There are a lot of outdated terms that I will not be using, of course, but I think I wrote them on the photo. I don't know if they did, but they start with trans. They're outdated. I'll discuss why further on in the video. When we get to like drag or cross-dressing, I'll probably use the term drag, or I might just throw that under gender nonconforming as well. But that is dressing in clothes that are associated with the other sex. And that's actually does happen regardless of sexuality. That might throw some people off. Like, you could have someone who's assigned male at birth who identifies as a man who wears a dress, or what our society has deemed feminine clothing, because that is honestly a very shallow thing. It's stuff you put on your body to cover up. It's not actually male or female. Oh dear. Okay, a lot of these characters I notice also have DID, or dissociative identity disorder. You may have in the past heard this as other things. That's like the split personality. I will just be referring to it as DID, as that is the current term. I will be abbreviating child abuse as CA going forward. And I think that's all of the terminology that we need. Okay. But I do want to talk a little bit about the history of trans in the DSM. If you don't know what the DSM is, it's the diagnostic manual that's utilized by the psychiatric community to diagnose people with mental illnesses or other things kind of associated with mental illness. Because I think some things outside of mental illness are also in there. So I'm getting all this from the APA, which is the American Psychiatric Association, which is the group that puts out the DSM, so they would be the ones to get it from. So it was not until 1980, with the publication of the DSM-3, that the diagnosis of, and I'm going to use an outdated term here, transsexualism first appeared. The DSM-4 in 1994, transsexualism, outdated term, don't use it, was replaced with gender identity disorder. And then in 2013, the DSM-5 replaced gender identity disorder, eliminating that, and replaced it with gender dysphoria, which is much better. That way you're not diagnosing an identity or a person, but rather symptoms they can feel due to living in the wrong body. And also, I think there's a comorbidity between, being queer as well as being trans with depression. And that doesn't come from being queer or trans. That comes from living in a society that is very hateful, and particularly towards trans people. Okay, moving on to the films and the stories that I'm going to be talking about. I think there's some factors to keep in mind. More terminology, I'm so sorry. I have to go through such a big thing before I can talk about these movies. But there's the text, or the textual evidence. That is what is in the movie. Dialogue, set design, setting, who's cast in the role. This is what is in the movie. Fact, inarguable. This is the text. Then we have context. The author intent, when and where it was made, who made it, the budget, stuff like that. What goes into making the movie, what's around the movie. And then we have interpretation, which generally would be audience, or, critic, which is also audience, but how people interpret the movie, how they read it, what they came away with. Before we talk about Psycho, which is going to be a very important film to talk about in all this, of course, we actually need to go to an older Hitchcock film first. Murder! Exclamation point. 1930 Hitchcock film. Kind of hard to find. I will say some of these movies I was not able to watch, so I might just kind of mention the title only. This film I did find the ending of online, but I was not able to watch the whole film, and I read the plot synopsis, which from my understanding essentially is this man kills someone. He's a circus performer, and then he goes on to dress in feminine clothing so as to hide from the police, and ultimately, I believe, takes his life at the end because this was made in 1930. I will talk about the Hays Code in a minute. But first I want to talk about Hitchcock and queer coding. I should actually, know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, you probably need to know what queer coding is first. So let's talk about the Hays Code now. The Hays Code was a form of self-censorship by the film industry in the United States, which spanned from 1934 to kind of the mid-60s. It was something that just slowly started fading out and was officially replaced by what is now known as the MPA's rating, which would be like NC-17, R, PG-13, PG, and so on. But back then they had a list of do's and don'ts, and a don't was you can't portray sexual perversion, which would be queer people. And under that would go, because again, this was the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they kind of combined any form of like gender nonconformity with sexuality, which again are different things, but to them in that time period, they were kind of merged into one thing. Again, different things. Incorrect. Yes. So, whoa. But filmmakers could get away with putting them in the movie if, they were like the villain of the movie or, something to make fun of. But also queer coding. So basically, they would put someone in a film and kind of, it would be a wink and a nod to the audience. I just winked twice. Oh, whatever. A wink and a nod to the audience for those in the know that, you can tell by looking at them or the way that they're acting or their backstory that this person is queer. So, for instance, you could have a woman wearing man's clothes back then would be a wink and a nod that this woman likes other ladies. You could have men talk in a very like lispy kind of accent or fluctuation to their voice, and that would be, oh, well, he's queer. You could have a man who's still a bachelor and lives with his mother. That would be a code that he's queer. We have these very kind of strict sociocultural views of gender roles. That's pretty much what gender is. I'll probably repeat this throughout the video, but gender in its most basic form, really, if you think about it, is the societal expectations that are placed upon you based on the genitalia between your legs and how people treat you based on what they believe is between your legs. And we're probably going to be talking about that a lot in this video. But clothing back in the day worked a lot better than it does now. Now it really only works for men. I think personally that there are much stricter rules for men as it pertains to presentation than for women. However, I think there are much stricter rules in terms of behavior and expectations for women than there are for men. Honestly, that's just an opinion, totally arguable. That's just kind of how I see it. Men have a lot of, you gotta look like this and dress like this. Women have a lot of, you need to do this, you need to do this, never do that, don't ever do that, don't ever do that, don't ever do that. You have a lot of positive and negatives in terms of your behavior for women, and then you have a lot of, mostly negatives for men. Just wear this. Just look like that. Maybe work out. Right? And really, we're going to get our lesson from Barbie. We're essentially all victims of gender socialization and the socio-cultural expectations laid upon us based on our gender. And not even on our gender, based on what, a doctor saw between our legs the day we were born. Anyway, moving back up to murder. Hitchcock did a lot of queer coding. Like a lot. If you look up Hitchcock and queer coding, you're probably just going to get his film Rope. But Psycho had queer coding. Again, we'll talk about that a lot. Rope had definite queer coding. Strangers on the Train, queer coded. Rebecca, very queer coded. But it's also written by Daphne du Maurier, who I believe was not a straight woman. And she also wrote the short story that The Birds is based on. And there is some queer coding in there as well. It's very, very much a queer story. By their definition, that was written by a queer person. But yeah, I've read quite a few books about this, and I've really thought about the topic ad nauseum. Really made me nauseous, literally. And I come away that I personally think that Hitchcock capitalized on homophobia, specifically the audience's fear of other, that's other with a capital O, for his entire career. I don't necessarily think that he was homophobic. They did not have the terminology for transphobia to even that, like, be something that registered in his existence at the time period. So I think he just capitalized on this fear of other in him to make his films. I don't think he had any form of like hatred himself. I mean, obviously he was purposely casting queer people in his films. I think for him it was the audience reaction that was most important, and he knew how to elicit said reaction. I mean, he's the king of suspense after all. Now I want to quote Monstrous Transgressions by Evelyn Nelson and Sacha Carney, an article. I'll have everything. Actually, I'm probably just going to have one link to a blog below, and there I'll have all of my sources, but I'm also going to try and put most of my quotes up beside me as a picture. In most trans horror representation depictions of transness, particularly trans femininity, are molded by cisgender anxiety, using some of the most harmful and disturbing misconceptions around transness under the guise of the horror genre. I just really think that's what Hitchcock was doing in most of these movies. He was picking people and using them to make people more afraid because of their misconceptions around gay people and also around transness for Psycho. So I guess let's talk about Psycho. We have Norman Bates, a mentally ill serial killer who dresses like a woman in a wig. By using a dress and a wig. Though from his perception, he is dressing like his mother, who he murdered when, I'm assuming he was a teenager. I was trying to get definitive dates, but I could not. This is, the first Psycho. 1960 Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock is the first modern, well, it's not the first modern slasher, but it is the modern slasher. It changed the landscape and trajectory of the entire horror franchise. It did a lot that, it's amazing that Hitchcock was able to do in 1960. First flushing toilet, my God, showing a woman in a brassiere, having sex unmarried, gasps. The Oedipal complex that launched 1,000 horror movies, really. It really, really was. And I think that's why a lot of these movies have this same twist ending, because they want to be Psycho. And they're not. None of them are. Sorry, De Palma. I don't like you. I said I wasn't going to be an indictment on any of these things. That's just my opinion. Again, I love Psycho. I love Psycho. You can love something, but acknowledge there's something wrong with it. But I want to talk about momism. Scary word. Yes, interfluoroid and time period misogyny and fear of the loss of masculinity. I just got this, if you look up the word momism, this is the first wiki hit you get. An excessive popular adoration and over-sentimentalization of mothers that is held to be Oedipal in nature and that is thought to allow overprotective or clinging mothers unconsciously to deny their offspring emotional emancipation and thus to set up psychoneurosis. So basically, I think it was starting around the 1950s, mid-1950s. I really can't remember who wrote this article, but someone wrote an article, and people started getting really freaked out by the idea about this loss of masculinity, and that overbearing mothers, or unloving mothers, or mothers who were loving their sons too much, Jesus, they couldn't do anything right, because women never can, lesson from Barbie, were making their sons less masculine or worse, gay. The horror. Ridiculousness. People aren't going to be surprised by this. Men being gay doesn't actually have much to do with their mom or their dad. Crazy, right? Wild. But people really thought that back then. And I think we still have this kind of idea when it comes to serial killers that a lot of them have an overbearing mother and a timid father. I'm going to talk about that in just a few moments. But yeah, also that does not make a serial killer. Go figure. Yeah, a mom. You could have the most abusive mother in the world that's not going to turn you into a serial killer. That might be surprising to people, but that's true. Abuse alone does not make a serial killer. It's got to be that perfect storm of the personality. It's the nature and the nurture. Because there are a lot more people who are abused that don't become serial killers than do. Shocking. Anyway, moving on. I'm going to talk about that more later, sadly. Okay, so I literally wrote in my note on Freud, homophobia, and misogyny. Words I hate. So there's a heavy criticism on mothers and a masculinity crisis. We see the overbearing, overloving mom creates a queer son. And this is also a way to queer code in the Hayes era. And oddly enough, that is a stereotype that persists today, which I don't really understand why, again. But that's just something that I think it comes down to something I'm going to say a lot. Who are we willing to demonize as a culture? And lesson from Barbie, it's women. Who was responsible for murder? Oh, well, his mother. No, the serial killer, who is generally speaking, overwhelmingly, serial killers are men who murder women while wearing pants. We'll get into that. Anyway, I am going to quote Psychosexual by David Grevin, which is a book that I read, for better or worse. Norman Bates is a queer male subject whose queerness is not registered through any explicit reference to his sexuality, even though at the same time he has inescapably been read as the homosexual. Yeah, again, that's what queer coding is. I think Norman definitely is a very queer-coded subject. I also want to get into Alexander Doty. This is like kind of a quote that's pulled from their book. Most critics and the public appear to be divided between understanding soft-spoken, stuttering Norman as another one of Hitchcock, crazy, and I mean crazy, blank and blanks, and finding him a frightening and or pitiable straight guy ruined by his too close relationship with his mother. Even in its straight incarnations, however, Norman's sexuality is understood as perverse somehow. He is the quintessential mama's boy gone horribly bad, but this incestuous mama's boy coding is also the basis for reading Norman as homosexual. Granted, the dominant cultural trope of mama's boy as homosexual is a tired one, but it has maintained its pop Freudian pop culture power. Absolutely. Absolutely it has. Definitely. I mean, I do read Norman as pitiable straight guy, but I've come away from blaming his mother for anything. Like, these were all Norman's actions. If anything, the only thing mother ever did wrong was not recognizing that her son was clearly very mentally ill and possibly putting him someplace. Definitely not taking a shower tonight. Okay, Alexander Doty also remarked on a reading of Norman Bates as asexual, and I just kind of want to like point out, well, they said they couldn't read, you can't read Norman as asexual because he has a peephole that he looks at his prey with, and you know, we don't know, we only see him looking at the peephole with Marion. And it is said that there are other missing cases. It doesn't say there are other missing women. It said other missing cases. And we've only seen him look at Marion, but that doesn't mean that he never looked through that peephole at a man. We don't know that. We have no way of knowing who else that he killed or looked at. And we do know, I'm kind of eliminating the sequels in this conversation. I'm really looking at Psycho because this is a movie that solo by itself without the rest of the franchise is what launched this trope, I think. Thanks, Hitchcock. But I would say to that is, one, asexuals do masturbate. Like they don't have no libido. They just don't have a sexual attraction. And also fetishizing, you know, that exists. I think there are people, in terms of like voyeurism, there are people who get sexually excited by looking at someone else and get excited by looking at them. And there are people who get sexually excited by looking and knowing that there's like a public component and that they could be found, and like they get excited by that. And we don't know which of those excites Norman. In fact, we don't know if Norman is even excited at all because it was 1960 and they couldn't show him masturbating. When we see Norman's room, it's very much a child's room. So I think there's this idea for me that Norman is someone who's very much stuck in boyhood. I mean, I think that's kind of the point the movie's trying to make. And he might be doing a lot of the things that he's doing, not because he's actually sexually aroused, but because he thinks that's what he's supposed to do. He's acting out like this gender role, this adult role. He knows, and I think a lot of queer people do that, particularly when they're younger. They'll date someone they're not attracted to because they've been told that that's what they're supposed to do. I think that's very, 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 very common, particularly for queer women. For better or worse, it's for worse. But he could just be playing this role, and then the mother side of him, goes and kills the woman. Okay. That's another conversation. Anyway, Norman has many queer markers to code him as such, as queer. Shy, timid, stuttering, mama's boy. That's a blaring red sign that says in bright rainbow letters, gay. Plus the casting of Anthony Perkins. Well, I mean, in hindsight would be very telling, which is probably worse for him as a person and for his career. Rest in peace, Anthony Perkins. I've seen quite a few Anthony Perkins, films. He's a phenomenal actor, and I really like Psycho 3. It's batshit crazy, but Anthony Perkins' directing was, I thought, very good. And he is, as a character and as a person in the film, juxtaposed with Sam Loomis, and there's this kind of like Sam Loomis is like the man's man, and Norman is this like perverse, deviant, not quite a man, as the film is trying to show us. And there's this actual kind of like cruising moment between them. I'm using cruising like cruising. It's an interesting moment, but we're going to move on from that. It's very queer coded, is all I'm saying. Norman kills women. And I really went back and forth and ultimately decided to read Norman as straight and certainly as cis. The queer coded is just using to make him more weird to the audience, but also hopefully more pathetic and sympathetic. But I wouldn't watch people's reactions, like, on YouTube people do reactions to movies they've never seen before. Psycho's a pretty popular one, and a lot of people came out with like looking at Norman as a monster, not pitiable, and I think that's really unfortunate because I think he is supposed to be quite pitiable. He's sad. But the audience ultimately is left with Norman as this mentally deranged person in a dress and a wig. And that, again, is the Oedipal complex that launched 1,000 gender reveal moments in cinema. The climax, the reveal at the end of the film, doesn't only just tell us who the killer is, but also that they are not the gender we were led to believe, and also that they're mentally ill, and therefore it connects in the audience's mind gender nonconformity with violence and insanity. And I want to emphasize, whether you are trans or gender nonconforming in any way, that has nothing to do with mental illness. And typically, we'll talk about this when we get to Silence of the Lambs, violence is very rare. Very rare. If anything, they're more likely to be the victims of violence. We'll get into those statistics later as well. And also, I even want to emphasize this because horror movies and ableism go together like besties. And I think that's actually more because of Halloween, though. But, mental illness and violence, like most serial killers are not mentally ill. We'll talk about that later as well. But there's this idea of connecting the three that is just a falsehood. But even the violence with the insanity is a falsehood. And certainly the gender nonconformity with insanity is a falsehood. Like, these are all, none of these things generally go together. And it's an easy way to just further other the killer by making them more different than the sit-het audience. And they become distinctly more frightening to them because so. Alright, we gotta talk Ed Gein. I've read this book, and then I read this really great article, which I'll be quoting a lot from, like a lot. So this is the real-life case that inspired Norman Bates's Psycho. Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and partially James Gumb in Silence of the Lamb. Did you know his name was James and not James? I feel like I never registered that, but it's James. Anyway, Ed Gein was a real person who was arrested, I believe, in December of 1957 in Wisconsin, but he began grave robbing around 1948. It might surprise some people that he was not queer or trans. He killed 2 women. He did rob graves, but there's a lot of misinformation about that. There are actually very little facts and loads of speculation that tend to err on the most bizarre side because sensationalism sells. Yellow journalism, 20th century clickbait, guys. Let's talk about how quoting works. Newspapers don't have to say facts. They just have to quote accurately. And you can quote someone who's talking bullshit. We'll talk about that. Anyway, Robert Bloch wrote a book that came out the next year with all the height of the sensationalism around this case, and then Psycho was made. So a lot was wrong. And I'm going to be quoting a lot, just like 2 pages worth of Ed Gein and the Figure of the Transgendered Serial Killer by K.E. Sullivan. Gein would eventually be tried for the murders of 2 women. The rest of the body parts were apparently obtained from graves he had robbed. The common consensus was that Gein sought out women who bore resemblance to his dead mother. Needless to say, these revelations stunned the community. Common consensus does not equal fact, and it does not equal truth. This is 48 to 57 in Wisconsin. How would he know what these women look like? He likely went to cemeteries, found recent graves, and dug them up. And yes, we don't even know if he only robbed the graves of women. We don't know who these graves belong to. That information was not released. We don't know if it was just women. We don't know the age span of these people. There's no idea. So we can't say that. That's just speculation. Again, that common consensus does not equal fact and it does not equal truth. Bloch took a number of liberties with the case. That's the guy who wrote the book. And many other reports were wildly inaccurate. Even now, it's difficult to shift fact from fiction. What seems very clear, however, is that Gein and the initial fictionalization of his case in the figure of Norman Bates in Psycho function as a larger cultural symbols which reflect contemporary concerns about masculinity, motherhood, and sexual deviance. I talked about that earlier with momism. The accounts cannot offer much information to support the conclusion that Gein was transgender individual or gay. Indeed, he is quite clearly interested in women, even if none returned this interest. Nor are any trans people or transgendered persons psychotic or murderers. In fact, most serial killers are heterosexual men whose victims are women or children. True. There were newspaper articles and magazine articles about this case of Ed Gein before he'd even seen a psychiatrist, and these things are quoted and recycled and taken as fact. They were not. I think it's called like armchair psychology. So this guy in Chicago, Dr. Edward Keller, was interviewed by the Journal. They gave him, facts about the case, and he made armchair diagnosis about like what he thought may have been why Ed Gein did this. Also, he's working on psychology from the 1950s. Again, had never met Ed Gein. So, but this is what's taken as truth. It wasn't. It was just a guy looking at like what may have happened and what may have led someone to do this. If anything, Ed Gein, from my understanding, is kind of more of a Frankenstein than a James Gumb or a Norman Bates. Certainly Leatherface. Anyway. The evaluations stressed that Gein was highly suggestible and had trouble distinguishing between what he remembered and what he was told, a potential problematic situation for Gein's police interrogations. We didn't really think a lot about leading questions until a lot later, especially with like children. We didn't really consider how to interview children, and I would say Gein had the mentality of a child because he was really quite mentally ill. In fact, I think he's the only serial killer that I could find that was institutionalized rather than going to prison for the acts he committed. we'll talk a little bit more about that down below. But yeah, so we really didn't know how to interview someone like Gein until after the McMartin preschool trial in the 90s. This is what really kind of made us realize we need to be careful about not putting words into people's mouths and how we interview people who are suggestible like that, like a child, essentially. It's difficult to discern whether Augusta Gein, that's Ed Gein's mother, was as overbearing as accounts indicate. Yes, ding, ding, ding. Or if the representations of her merely dovetail with 1950 attitudes about bad mothers. Yes, ding, ding, ding. At any rate, Augusta, as a castrating harpy mother figure, both reflects and explains Ed's deviance. She is, according to popular accounts, in many ways the monster behind the monster. Ironically, Gein described his father, not his mother, as abusive, indicating that George Gein was an alcoholic who drank excessively and abused both Ed and his brother. Given the era's paranoia about improper influences of mothers on sons, it's not difficult to understand the lack of attention paid to the role Ed father in the formulation of Gein's psychosis. Yeah, I mean, you read this a lot when it pertains to like serial killers. You'll see, some reports of like timid father, overbearing mother. And I've seen that with Gein. And it's like, I'm sorry, if the man who's like, you can be an alcoholic and timid, but if you're beating your sons, timid is not a word I would use to describe you ever. Not even close. That's not a timid person. That's an abusive person. 1950s United States was rife with fear about homosexuality, mothers, and male effeminacy. Like effeminacy, homosexuality and transness typically became attributed to improper mothering, either too much or too little affection. Again, women can't do anything. Barbie lesson, nothing we do is right. Improper mothering not only provided an explanation for the etiology of sexual deviance, but also for the origins of antisocial behavior or psychosis. Mid-century United States, reeling from the effects of the Kinsey Report, obsessed not only about popular masculinity and the threat of homosexuality, but about the relation of failed mothering to homosexuality and crime. Men are never responsible for their own actions. Like, this man murdered, like, even Ted Bundy, murdered women. Dude in pants, murdering women. Well, it's his mother's fault and the grandmother's fault because they lied to him. Seriously? Maybe he hated his mother because he's a misogynist. Anyway, moving on. However, as a culture, we are unable to admit or recognize the connection between our dominant forms of masculinity and violent misogynist crimes. Ding. Ding. That we must attribute some other kind of motive to them besides masculinity. Yes. Instead, motive is attributed to perceived gender deviance, in particular to men coveting or assuming the mantle of femininity through gender identification or homosexual objective choice. This murderous rage is queered, and queerness becomes the privileged signifier for psychotic violence. And the last quote I have is, Gein still reflects and embodies our cultural anxieties about proper masculinity, motherhood, and non-heteronormative sexuality. Again, that was all from Ed Gein and the Figure of the Transgender Serial Killer by K.E. Sullivan. Absolutely nailed it. Yes, very true. Ridiculous and sad, but true. And I want to emphasize that most serial killers are men. Over 90% of serial killers are men. Women account for 8.6% of serial killers, estimating. So yeah, most serial killers are straight men in pants. And when there's a section, and often serial killers, there's a sexual component to the crime. So it's men killing women, overwhelmingly. Women accounted for 70% of the known 1,398 victims during 1995 and 2010. Of gay serial killers, I know of 3. Jeffrey Dahmer. Who did he kill? Women? No. Dudes. He killed men. Tragically. And got away with it so long because he was killing other queer men and men of color. So police didn't really care. John Wayne Gacy. Who did he kill? Boys and men. And why did he get away for so long? Because cops don't want to look at queer stuff. And then lastly, Albert Fish. He did kill boys and girls, but that is a different situation that is so disturbing and gross. We're just going to move on. But he killed very young children. Yeah. Okay, so I looked up cross-dressing serial killer. It's not really a thing. It's not really a thing. I found one, and he was not a cross-dresser. But he was labeled as such, even though it wasn't true. He dressed as a woman to obscure his crime from the police. And we'll talk about that, because it absolutely fits into the pattern of these films. So I want to emphasize cross-dressing, whether forced or not, like with Angela Bacon's Sleepaway Camp, does not cause someone to become a serial killer. Or a killer in general. No. It can cause depression, possibly trauma, maybe dysphoria. It's almost like someone being forced to live and act as a gender they're not is unhealthy. Of transgendered serial killers, I found 3. There was a German woman in 1990, an American woman who was arrested for a much earlier crime in 2014, and then another trans woman who's been arrested quite a lot. Weirdness. But yeah, it's not a common. I found 3 of the hundreds of serial killers. 3. It's not a common thing. It's so rare. It's so wildly rare. And then I also wanted to point out with dissociative identity disorder, no serial killers, none, 0, not a thing. I found someone he committed a different serial act of a type of assault. And his name was Billy Milligan. He was the first person diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder to raise such a defense, and the first acquitted of a major crime for this reason. But I actually can't find any who committed murder. So transgender people are over 4 times more likely than cis people to be victims of violent crimes. Less than 2 million people in the United States identify as trans. Yeah, I also wanted to point out that you have a 1 in 200 chance of being the victim of a murder, but you have a 1 in 17,824 chance of being killed by a serial killer. Very rare. It's so rare. And lastly, I wanted to point out, not a lot of crimes are committed by people with DID, because that is a very rare thing, but like of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are responsible of 10% of all homicides in the U.S. Again, it's very rare, and they're not serial killers. Maybe one. But that's not, I'll talk about that later, actually, because I think it makes sense a little later. Oh, the pattern. I want to pull a quote from Monstrous Transgressions by Evelyn Nelson and Sasha Carney again. Overall, horror views the trans feminine body as the perpetrator of violence, a thing that produces and replicates violence on innocent cis women to achieve intended femininity. By contrast, the cultural fear of transmasculinity centers around the transmasculine body as an unintentional victim of gendered violence. So we pity the trans man because people still view that man as a woman. And we look down on and fear and hate the trans woman. The reasons I still don't get. This is from Ed Gein, The Figure of the Transgender Serial Killer by K.E. Sullivan. He starts with referencing Mrs. Doubtfire, Tootsie, Bosom Buddies, and Some Like It Hot. The guise of femininity ultimately promotes both his masculine power and his heterosexuality. And the joke of the film is on other male characters who cannot read the protagonist's true nature. The second version of gender nonconforming in contemporary media also involves discovery about the truth of the character's body. Such a revelation, however, is not comedic but horrific. Here, the guise of femininity does not hide or empower a clever heterosexual man, but reveals a monster gender and sexual deviant, a man in gender distress. If a character has a transgender body, this detail usually is tied to some dark and horrible secret in the narrative, and the revelation about the truth of the body, that a woman has a penis, so on, typically is revealed simultaneously with the revelation of another secret. There is a serial killer. Indeed, monstrosity or deviance almost exclusively marked images of transgender individuals. allowing for little, if any, sympathy from the spectator. So the pattern I found is that a lot of these characters in the gender reveal are mentally ill, typically with DID or some other form of mental illness. Psycho, Dressed to Kill, House at the End of the Street, Blade in the Dark, maybe? That was a giallo film. I mean, honestly, I didn't quite understand it. There's child abuse, in which they were forced to live as the gender they do not identify with. So we have Unhinged, Sleepaway Camp, Deadly Blessing, Reflection of Fear, Insidious Chapter 2, Private Parts, and Homicidal. We just have cross-dressing, which would be like Silence of the Lambs, maybe. I got a lot to say about that one. And Cherry Falls. Hiding, or cross-dressing to hide or obscure their crime. Murder! Terror Train, Strict to Kill, Fatal Games. But also Mrs. Doubtfire, Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, and Scooby Doo 2. Then we have someone who's actually trans, which sometimes is better representation, sometimes not. Buddy Boy, Soapdish, I want to talk a little about Bit, Dr. Jekyll, Sister Hyde. So I'll get into these. We're halfway through, and I can finally start talking about the movies. So again, spoiler for all these movies. Okay, the mentally ill, cross-dressing, serial killer, slasher. Why is it when these characters have a DID, they have a female side and a male side, and the female side is always the killer? I'm not saying it has anything to do with misogyny, but it definitely does. People overlook issues, I feel like, in movies that are good or well made, while often ignoring really sincere, beautiful moments in bad movies. I'll talk more about this when I talk about Ed Wood and Glinda, but I do think that's unfortunate for a lot of these movies. Again, I don't necessarily want to indict them, but I do think that they have a lot of transphobia and homophobia in them. And again, it's okay to like these movies. I love Psycho. I like quite a lot of these other movies too, but it's okay to, again, acknowledge them as being movies you like or love, and as well as being well made, but also having the context of the film, the plot, being very problematic and being an issue. Especially because a lot of people, I think it's important to know, a lot of people don't know someone who's trans. And so the only place they're getting information about trans people is from movies like this. It is horrifically problematic and causes real world harm. Okay, anyway, back to Psycho. So I just wanted to recap Psycho. Norman Bates is someone who we view as having an overbearing mother, though we don't actually know that for a fact because we never meet her. We only meet Norman's interpretation of her, which might be extremely biased by his very misogynistic view, and that is formed by the culture of the time that was very negative towards women. Anyway, he is a queer-coded, though probably not queer, person who's abused by his mother, murdered his mother, is very mentally ill, has DID, and the audience ultimately ends up seeing a serial killer, a mentally ill serial killer, in a dress and wig. So let's move along to Hitchcock's biggest fan, Brian De Palma, who just rips him off all the time. I said what I said. I don't like De Palma. I'm sorry. I just can't get into him. Dressed to Kill, I watched it once. I honestly did not like it. I can recognize it as being a well-made movie. Nancy Allen is so beautiful. Michael Caine was so miscast. But yeah, Michael Caine plays Dr. Elliot. I would say that Dr. Elliot is a trans woman. So Bobby is the female aspect of Dr. Elliot, and is dressing up in feminine clothing and donning a wig to kill women that get her sexually aroused because, she has erection dysphoria, I guess. Typically when we talk about gender dysphoria, when we see depictions of that in film, we see someone who is assigned female at birth taping their breasts down. We never see gender dysphoria as it pertains to people who are assigned female at birth having it in regards to their hips, which is very realistic, or their slight frame. We definitely never see it to people who are assigned male at birth having gender dysphoria in regards to their genitals. Anyway, sexism. This is also, I do think it's important to note that back then, they would not really have thought this. To go back up to the DSM-3, they really had, I'm going to use modern terminology, a true transgender person and someone who they saw as being like in drag. So if you were I'm so sorry, it only looked at what they would view as men. So if you were a trans woman who was attracted to, women? You were a true transgender person? Is that right? I might be getting this backwards. But yeah, they didn't, in their opinion, oh, I'm so sorry. If you were a trans woman who was attracted to men, you were a true transgender person. If you were a trans woman who was attracted to women, you were not a true trans person. You were a queer guy who liked to wear women's clothing. I think that's right. So backwards. It's hard to like wrap your mind around. Jesus. But it's like, heads up, you can be a trans woman and a lesbian. Shocking. Ridiculous people. Oh my God. See, this is why you shouldn't just have men in psychology. They dumb. Anyway, I think what's most problematic about Billy is that she is killing specifically and explicitly because she is trans. She's killing because she's trans. That is her whole motivation. It's called dressed to kill, for fuck's sake. She's a person with a penis who dons on a dress, heels, and a wig to kill because she is having a lot of issues in regards to her penis, and she's living in an era that's not letting her be herself. I think that's also kind of made explicit in the movie, but not well, personally. Yeah. But this, I think, is the worst of the movies I'm talking about. Like, the worst offender. Because with the other ones, I mean, at least there's a little bit of, for the most part, there's a little bit more effort. Not always. About talking about House at the End of the Street. Oh my God. The Jennifer Lawrence one. Lord. It's just psycho. We have Ryan, played by Max Terrio. And, okay, so when he was a kid, his sister died. They had very abusive parents who forced Ryan to dress like Carrie Ann. Then he develops DID, and started dressing as Carrie Ann in like a dress and a wig, and starts murdering women for reasons I'm actually not 100% unsure of. Actually, my original takeaway of this movie is if a bunch of people are telling you that this poor boy whose entire family was murdered in a house is like mentally ill and you should stay away from him, which would further possibly make him more ill and depressed, you should stay away from him. That's what the movie says, which is horrible. But then when I got a little older and I realized, oh, okay, this movie's also just like very inappropriate and like ripping off Psycho and Sleepaway Camp. It's not good. I mean, even if you had, like, the little girl was actually alive the whole time and locked in the basement by her parents and she starts killing people, that doesn't make sense either. Like, when you look at these, like, children who are, like, locked up by their parents for years, none of them have become serial killers. That just doesn't happen. Ridiculous. Nonsense. It's nonsense. And we don't need a dude in a dress and a wig killing people. We have Blade in the Dark. Again, Giallo film. I didn't really get it. I watched the whole thing. I keep trying to watch Giallo and like it, and I just don't. But yeah, we have a guy in a dress and a wig killing people, but I think that is what it was about, and I don't know why. And then the main character kills them. I'm just going to move on from that one. Okay, so obviously some of the cases from above, I keep saying above and below because I'm reading an article that I wrote, but you know what I mean, from before, had instances of child abuse, but this is the child abuse section. There's a lot of crossover in this, diagram of sadness. So Reflections of Fear is a movie that exists. I don't recommend it. Marguerite is a character who's assigned male at birth, but was forced to live as a girl by their mother and grandmother. I don't think they're really aware. They're homeschooled, and I think they're just very unaware and naive about all of that kind of stuff. And they do end up developing like an imaginary friend, which I think is like supposed to be like DID. So they have a male and female side, just like fucking Bobby and Dressed to Kill. I'm not 100% sure which is the one who's killing people. I didn't like the movie. I was very bored by it. I don't know. But this, at the end of the film, does have something that we see a lot, which is when it is revealed that Marguerite was assigned male at birth. From that moment on, Marguerite does not have another line of dialogue. They're reduced to like these like wild animalistic noises. Again, we see that a lot. And we're going to see it with Angela Baker, which I'm about to talk about in Sleepaway Camp. And we also see that in what I call the disappointment room trope. And that is when a character is revealed to be, I hate using the word deformed, but I legitimately don't know a better word. When a character is revealed to be deformed, suddenly they're going from being able to articulate themselves quite well to making all these wild, weird noises. And they don't have any line of dialogue. They become monstrous. And it is very dehumanizing. And I don't know why that's done, but it is done quite often in this case, as well as the aforementioned, deformed reveal case. It's very strange. Anyway, I don't like it. If I'm giving a movie any level of star rating, it automatically goes down 2 stars for me for that, because it's really weird. And I do, you know what? Also see it a lot in Giallo. Italy, what are you doing? In the US too, but a phenomena pops in my head. Anyway, moving on. Sleepaway Camp. Angela Baker. Angela Peter is... Okay, we're only looking at the first film, not the subsequent sequels, which do make Angela a trans woman. I guess officially? Unofficially? In canon. So Angela is abused by their aunt Martha. If you don't know, so there's Peter and Angela at the beginning with their gay dads. Beautiful, love to see it. There's an accident. Not beautiful, hate to see it. The father and Angela, the sister, are killed. Peter and the dad's boyfriend live, obviously in this time period. Unfortunately, Angela/Peter could not be adopted by gay daddy too. Tragic. So I have to go live with crazy Aunt Martha, who forces Peter to become their sister Angela. Very similar to House at the End of the Street, where Ryan is forced to become by their parents, Carrie Ann. Anyway, I guess a lot of people don't catch that, but that's what's up. Moving on. There could be a Transmasc read to this film if you eliminate the sequels, that Angela is someone who is being forced to live with the gender that they do not identify as. In this case, it just so happens to be the gender that aligns with their assigned gender at birth. Anyways, but yeah, the reveal is that she's a boy. At the end of the movie, Angela kills Paul and is sitting there. I mean, they're what? 13, 14, something like that. They're very young, completely nude. Paul's dead. They stand up, and Ronnie's like, she's a boy. Not, oh my god, Paul's dead. Or like, shock. Or like, they're the killer. She's a boy. That is the reveal. She's a boy. That's it. And Angela doesn't have a single line of dialogue after said reveal. They're just like, making the weird noises. I don't like that. There's a lot of objectification of trans bodies for shock value. Like, you don't need to strip Michael Myers to show he's an insane killer. It's wildly dehumanizing. And it's taking away their autonomy and personality and voice, reducing them only to body parts. Horrible. And yeah, it just happens a lot. I don't like them. You're essentially robbing them of their voice after, in this case, outing them. Ridiculous. In an article from Bloody Disgusting by Harmony Colangelo, to the uninformed, the fear of being a killer is usurped by the killer being a woman who is lying about being a woman. That queer panic becomes a new central fear that equates trans people to a grab bag of destructive assumptions. The trans panic becomes the more scary than the threat of death. Right? Ronnie should have said anything other than she's a boy. It should have been Oh my god, Paul's dead. Insidious Chapter 2. This is the most frustrating of them all. It's not. It's not. This one frustrates me the most because it is the most recent on this list. We have Parker Crane, aka the Bride in Black, who had a very abusive mother and became a serial killer. Not only was, forced to dress and behave as a girl, which clearly they did not feel as though they were, but also was forced to be a killer and may also have been possessed by their mothers and may not have actually killed anyone of their own volition. And the whole castration thing, did they do that to themselves or because of the abuse, or were they possessed by their mother and did it? Like, the mom was haunting them, right? Like, there's so many unanswered questions, but things that are kind of like implied or seem like they might be the case. But it gets very up its own rear end. Like, I actually watched that movie and tried to figure out what is the Bride in Black doing of their own volition versus what is the woman in white, their mother Michelle, making them do. It's, when you watch it at that lens, it's very confusing. So the Bride in Black, Parker Crane, is just in a dress and a wig and was severely abused by their mother Michelle, the woman in white. Parker might not have killed anyone of their own volition. It's really hard to tell. And it could definitely have a Transmasc read. But I was watching like the interviews at the end of the movie you can find, like from people who were working on the movie. I don't remember who said this. It was a woman. And she said, even in the first movie, they had Parker Crane, the Bride in Black, played as a man before they had a story for them because there's something not right about a man in a dress. Are you serious? Are you fucking serious? And we do see this kind of a bit, right? With sometimes directors will hire men to play a woman just because it has an uncanny look to it from their perspective, right? We have this Zelda in Pet Sematary. There's a man playing a woman to make them look more sickly because Zelda's supposed to be this, very, I don't know what she has, scoliosis or something. She's supposed to look very weird, and then, okay, no one watched this movie but me, but Black Christmas 2006, the character of Agnes, who's supposed to be this like inbred, killer, is played by a man, even though she is definitely a girl. Yeah, we see this and it's like, why are you doing that? Movie, don't do that. Moving on to Unhinged. Marion Penrose, designed male at birth, but made to dress and behave as a woman by their abusive mother. This is a rare case where after it is revealed that, they are assigned male at birth, but, appearing as a woman, that they express, not only do they express anything after, but they express dysphoria and also pretty severe misogyny. Like, they hate women. And definitely as a Transmasc read, this is kind of very unintentionally kind of one of the more progressive ones. Marion is literally a man forced to live as a woman and hates it and hates women for it in a way that you can kind of understand. But it's clearly like the character Marion, their gardener, Norman. I wonder what this movie wanted to be like. I would say this movie's really boring though, actually. The acting not on the, I don't know who played Marion, but on the victims, some of the worst acting I've ever seen. Truly terrible. Truly terrible. This is Marion's quote. It's very long. But basically, just expressing how much they hate women. I wanted to quote Robert Settle, serial killer in cinema and analytical filmography with an introduction. Unhinged portrays a society of women as monstrous, perverse abhorrence, which corrupts and ironically consumes itself. The killer, whose aggressive gaze is coded as masculine, considers such young women groveling subhuman figures, and his crimes are in part expressions of the person he has been forced to become and the gender he has been forced to adopt. It's self-hatred and gender confusion as much as it is misogyny. I actually totally agree. But again, I think unintentionally, this is kind of one of the more progressive portrayals. And we have Deadly Blessing. Listen, Wes Craven, you could have had murderous Hittites. That would have been interesting. But no, you have the non-religious family with the misandrinist, so woman or man-hating, it's getting confusing, man-hating mother who forced her child, who was assigned male at birth, to grow up as a woman, and they're both killers. What? Just have the religious people be the killers. Damn. Anyway, yeah, once Faith is revealed to be assigned male at birth, then they don't have another line of dialogue. Again. We have 2 movies, neither of which I could find, that have Transmasc, like trans men, which are Private Parts and Homicidal. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I did watch Homicidal. It was just very boring. But yeah, Homicidal, assigned female at birth, but would only get the money from their wealthy father if they were a boy, because they have a sister, so they needed a boy to get the money. So this poor kid was forced to be raised as a boy and brutally abused so that, they could get inheritance. And yeah, it does not go well for them. They become a murderer. But typically we see trans femme killers overwhelmingly, and there's just this fear and hatred for trans femme people, sadly. I want to shift a little, talk about cross-dressing. I could not find where I got this quote from. I'm so sorry, but it is a quote. Citation needed. I suck. But cross-dressing challenges the basic assumption that biological sex predetermines gender, which constitutes the basis for compulsory heterosexuality. In addition, female to male transness challenges patriarchal order. So cross-dressing, I would say good representation. I don't know, maybe not, but better. And I love this movie. Rocky Horror Picture Show. Frankenfurter's reveal as a cross-dresser is not linked to him as a killer or with his reveal as a killer. That's the first thing we see. And he is very proud of it, right? He has a whole song about it. He's not hiding it. There's no secret. So the film doesn't equate cross-dressing with killing or other deviant behavior. Obviously, he is killing and doing other deviant behavior, but they're not linked. And that's what's important. And in fact, it kind of makes more fun of the normal heteronormative couple, Brad and Janet, who are kind of looking aghast at Frankenfurter. They're the abnormal ones. It's very, very Addams Family, and we love to see that. And we have Cherry Falls. The character of Leonard Marlston is a teacher, and they are a man dressing up like their mother in a dress and wig to get revenge because their mother was assaulted by some men in power in this town, and he wants to kill them and get revenge. It's very similar to Roman in Scream 3. This movie is very post-Scream, actually. But again, this is the only one where it's we have someone in a dress and a wig that I feel kind of makes a little more sense. And I do like someone questions why he's wearing lipstick, and he replies, because it makes me feel pretty, which is probably not why he's doing it, but I love that. Go off. And I like that he's killing, he is seen as the ultimate bad guy in the film over the people who sexually assaulted his mother and ruined her life. Are we talking about Silence of the Lambs next? Yes, we are. So we'll talk about that. Who are we willing to see as the villain? Who are we willing to demonize? Yes, I said it again. Silence of the Lambs. Jane Gum, a trans woman. I'm going to say they're a trans woman. The awful diagnosis, the cross-dressing, the autonomy, or lack thereof, is someone based off of Ed Gein. They have them wanting to don on a woman's suit, which is not what Ed Gein was trying to do. It's not what Ed Gein was trying to do. So, quote from the film, there's no correlation in literature between outdated term, transsexualism, and violence. Outdated term, transsexuals are very passive. To which, that is a quote from Clarice, to which Hannibal Lecter replies, look for severe childhood trauma disturbances associated with violence. Our Billy wasn't born a criminal, Clarice. He was made one through years of systematic abuse. Our Billy hates his own identity, you see. He always has, and he thinks that makes him a transsexual, outdated term. But his pathology is 1,000 times more savage and terrifying. I'm going to quote Ed Gein in The Figure of the Transgender Serial Killer by K. Sullivan. The movie and the 1988 novel of the same name posit that there are good psychopathic killers and bad psychopathic killers. Some are seductive and attractive and therefore helpful, while others are merely monstrous. In contrast, the film presents the other serial killer as deviant, as monstrously horrific. Buffalo Bill is coded as hideously queer, a gay man who lisps and caravats around in a dungeon basement carrying a fluffy poodle named Precious, which was also the poodle in Elvira. Just saying. The main narrative revelation then hinges on showing Bill's motivation for killing. They want to fashion a woman suit. And the details of their transgendered body. The narrative suggests that they are monstrous not so much through killing, after all, Lecter kills too, but because they are a man who sews, wear makeup, and desires a sex change operation. In this sense, then, the term monster and transgender collapse. The latter becomes a privileged signifier of the former. Meaning when you associate one, you associate the other. Or like when you see one, you then associate the other. Okay, so when you see someone who's transgender, you now associate that with monster. What is horrible about Bill is not that they kill women, but that they want to dress up as a woman. Cannibalism, that's so hard. Typically a horrifying prospect, in effect becomes effaced by the narrative structure. Yeah. Hannibal's the good serial killer. Buffalo Bill's the sick deviant, is what they're essentially saying. Ron Votter is quoted in Psychosexual by David Grevin. The filmmakers do go out of their way to make Hannibal heterosexual. He's the good villain. The bad villain, the serial murderer of women, is depicted as a gender nonconforming, or queer gender nonconforming, even though most people who kill women by far are straight men in pants. And then I wanted to quote the article that Harmony Colangelo wrote from Bloody Disgusting. Despite insistence in the film and novel that Bill is not actually trans, the damage this character has done in public opinion of the trans people cannot be understated, especially when all of the coding in both versions of this story entirely present a trans character. Clarice points out that there is no correlation between trans people and violence. However, you cannot then respond to that by shooting your own Bill isn't trans, Clarice argument in the foot by having a cis character written by a cis author decide that a character isn't trans just so that they can exonerate themselves from actually villainizing the trans community whilst benefiting from trans panic and describing what a trans person is and common discriminations they face. Yeah. We see a lot of doctors and specifically psychiatrists define and diagnose not only mental illness, which is totally fine. That's what they're there for. That's their expertise. That's their authority. That's what they should be doing. But also transness, which again, due to the DSM, was something diagnosable for a while, which is a problem. More than that, they are used to say who is, and more often than not, who is not trans. It's used to distance the film from having trans representation, which they have regardless in almost all of these examples due to the coding. And they use this because they're capitalizing on transphobia and homophobia of the audience's fear of that other. They're doing this specifically for shock value, and they're demonizing a minority who is often the victim of violence by saying they're the perpetrator, which is not true. It is simply not happening. For me, the issue is this assertion that stated that Jane believes they are trans. Like they're hallucinating their freaking transness. More to the point, the book and movie don't give you anything else. I see a lot of people saying that the problem is they don't show you juxtaposed to James, someone who is trans. I think the issue is, like if Norman Bates in Psycho, we don't just get, they're not just, oh, he's not trans. He has DID. He has something else. We're given something else. We don't sub out gender nonconforming or transness with anything else for James. And to be clear, even that subbing out transness for mental illness is loaded with problems with ableism and is a very harmful narrative, which is also very false. It's almost saying that if someone is insane, they cannot be trans, which is like, no, that's not how that works. Or worse still, it says that trans presenting people aren't really trans, they're just mentally ill men who are violent and deprived, which also is not true. Or it's worse, they're saying they're deceptive. And deceptive, an interesting note that I just noted there just then with that note. We see James deceiving a girl, Charlotte, Carol, I don't remember her name. I'm not good with names. I'm a female. By pretending to have a broken arm, which is what Ted Bundy did. A straight man wearing pants who murdered women because he's a misogynist. James then dumps the bodies in the river. James is clearly very thought out and planned and covering up their crimes. And in the US, because of this, they would not get the insanity defense. Insanity is a legal term, not a mental health term. And what is defined in mental health as what is, not of needing help is not the same as insanity in legal terms. If you are making efforts to cover up your crime, yeah, the odds of you being able to get and plead insanity, real low, like not happening. It's not going to work for you. Sorry, sis. Serial killers rarely ever could take that plea because they're killing multiple people over a time period. That's what a serial killer is. And to do so, generally, have to plan out and cover up said crime. Serial killers are generally very strategic, planned out, and organized. So they're not going to be able to plead insane because to do that, they need to not be aware of what they're doing. Like that's the main thing. If you are aware of what you're doing, well then, you were aware enough to not have done it. Okay? And in fact, I can only name 2 people. Well, technically 3. Well, okay, 3. And that's pushing it, the 3. 3 people who were able to claim, serial killers who were able to claim insanity. Albert Fish, but he got the death penalty because he murdered little children. I mentioned that above. Really gross. And I don't know, it's impossible to know. He had the option, but did not, I don't think, pled that way. And he was found guilty and did get the death penalty. So I don't think, and he was covering up his crimes. Like, he did flee from the police. He was very mentally ill, but organized enough to, know what he was doing was wrong. David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam killer, again, he had the option to plead that way. He did not. I think he pled guilty. And also, I think got the death penalty. I don't quite remember. This is not really important. And then Ed Gein was the only one that I know of that I could find in a cursory, just Google search, who did plead that way and did go to an institution that, was a serial killer. But yeah, that's generally how can you say that James is too mentally ill to understand and have autonomy of their own body and identity while showing us a very organized killer who is fully capable of committing and covering up their crimes? Oh, but they're not trans. They're too sick to know. They don't know. What? The textual evidence says James is not trans. That is the context of the film. That is the literal dialogue. But the audience is still left with a queer-coded, gender nonconforming character who's killing women because they want to be a woman. And that last part does sound like want to be a woman. Sounds very trans to me. Not the killer part. That doesn't. But I'm not a psychiatrist in the 20th century, so I can't properly diagnose your identity like they did. Oh God, and then we get to the sad turfy part. Hiding to get away with your crime or commit your crime. Did I mention it was turfy? So using the female form to gain aspect or access to female spaces. Aspect. I want you gain aspect. Words are hard sometimes. So up top when I was talking about the Alfred Hitchcock film Murder, like the exclamation point, that's what that movie is. We have Fatal Games, which I couldn't find, but for me kind of looks like a graduation day. It's an 80s slasher where you have someone who's assigned male at birth who's trying to be in the Olympics but couldn't, so they have a gender reassignment surgery to have a female appearance so that they could be in the Olympics and win, but they don't. I don't know. That movie's bad. I couldn't find it. That's just the synopsis, and I found some clips of the ending and stuff. But yeah, no, that's the most turfy BS of them all. Terror Train, the Jamie Lee Curtis 80s slasher. You have the character Kenny, who disguises themselves as real life David Copperfield, like literally David Copperfield. Female assistant, wig and dress. Honestly, they rocked it. They looked very good in it. Like, way to go, lovely assistant. Nailed it. And yeah, at the end, they're revealed to be, Kenny in a wig and a dress who is in disguise. There's the film Strip to Kill, where I think this guy killed his sister and then adopts her identity to so people won't know that they're dead. Terrible. Scooby Doo 2. Very Scooby Doo. How do you Scooby? Did James Gunn write that script? Scooby. Alicia Silverstone is revealed to really be a man in a mask. I'm just gonna move on. Mrs. Doubtfire. Listen, I love Mrs. Doubtfire so much because Robin Williams, and I love the idea that a father would do anything to be with his children. I think that's a very sweet message. And ultimately, I think the message of, it's okay. Sometimes parents get divorced and it doesn't mean they don't love you. It's a beautiful message, but they went about it in the wrong way. Why couldn't he have dressed up like an old man? You can do old woman makeup, but you can't do old man makeup? Bro. Yeah, man in a dress and a wig. Moving on. I have a review of Incubus. I don't know. This is a supernatural one, which I try to stay away from. I didn't want to talk about freaky with body swap because I feel like it's an entirely different thing. But this is Incubus. So this is a demon with a penis who has the shape of a woman, Laura, who is using their shape as a woman to gain, specifically in the book anyway, to gain access to female spaces. Very turfy. Moving on. Ace Ventura. I have a lot to say about this one, and I'm so sorry, but also I'm not sorry because I have a lot to say about this one, guys. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. Listen, we all know Einhorn is Finkel. Finkel is Einhorn. The public outing of it all. The faux vomiting, which is very common post-Crying Game in 1992. And this film even goes so far as to have the Crying Game by Boy George being played during the revelation. Really? I actually wrote in my notes, fucking really. But really? Okay, so I wrote this down because I was really confused. So we have Finkel joined the Miami Dolphins in 1982, lost the Super Bowl, went home, was harassed to the point of literal mental breakdown, was institutionalized by 1984. In 1984, learned that this hiker, Lois Einhorn, went missing, and so they assumed their identity and went so far as to have surgical and probably hormonal changes so that they had reassignment surgery, right? And that they look like a woman. At some point, joined the Miami Police Department and rose all the way up to the lieutenant in just a matter of a few years. Honestly, girl, get it. It's hot, but they would this movie. It seems like a trans femme character to me, but they also gave them these, and I think a lot of these movies kind of do give them some very negative stereotypes that are associated with bisexuals. Now they're depicted as being hypersexual. Maybe I'm talking a little bit about the Crying Game too here. There's this extreme emphasis on sex when it comes to anyone who isn't heteronormative and is gender normative a word? If not, you get what I mean. Cis. I don't know why I didn't say cis, but like gender normative. Whatever. You get what I mean. They are, I think that's why we distance ourselves from the word homosexual and, outdated term, transsexual, to de-emphasize the sexual aspect and the connections to the psychiatric terminology. In fact, from what I could find, outdated term, transsexual, originated in the medical community. And I think homosexual did too. This is not a trans or gender nonconforming community term. Like, they didn't come up with that word. This is a medical term. And I think that's why I would say, well, I know we don't use that word anymore, but people still use homosexual. And to you, I would say, stop. It's outdated. Move on. And then also the faux vomiting scene at the end when Ace Ventura literally outs poor Lois. I'm putting an R in there and I can't stop. Lois Einhorn. We see this a lot in movies again. I think it started with The Crying Game. So a dude is interested in a woman, finds out they were assigned male at birth, and begins to spit, vomit, shower, rinse, repeat. We saw this in like Family Guy, I know, The Crying Game, Soapdish. We've seen a lot of movies. I don't watch a lot of comedies, but there are comedies where like men are dressed as women, and then it's supposed to be an actual trans woman, and then it's revealed that they, at one point, or maybe still do, have a penis, and then, oh my god. Like, why are they so horrified at the idea that they could be attracted to someone who maybe used to have a penis, or maybe does? Like, are men afraid of penises? Because I kind of get the sense they are. Like, screw castration anxiety, Freud. Like, and the erection dysphoria. Like, I think straight men have phallophobia. Like, legitimately, I think straight men are very afraid of other people's penises. Like, I think they're legitimately terrified of other people's penises. And I don't get why. It's like, I feel like there's this idea that they're confronted with their own sexuality, and are very homophobic, too. But, like, why are you disgusted with someone else's gender identity? But also I want to point out real world harm. There's the trans panic defense. This is this really disgusting thing, similar to like the honor slang with gay people. Disgusting world we live in. But more than the depictions on screen is overwhelmingly pre-op trans women, which also I don't know why. I didn't want to look up any like numbers on that because I feel like that's rude. Like, it doesn't, I want to say in reality, it does not matter what is between your legs. But I mean, in terms of like sexual relations, I think for most people it does. There should not be any violence attached to that. Full stop. Ever. There should not, when it comes to sex and having it, the prospect of being with someone intimately, there should never be violence attached to that unless it's consensual. I want to talk a little about some things that are like, hey, we actually have some trans characters here, for better or worse. We have Nicole Maines, a trans actor. She's awesome. I really loved her in Supergirl. She's in a vampire movie called Bit. Cool movie. Wild Zero, couldn't find it, but from my understanding, there's someone who has like the Crying Game, like, oh my god, it's a woman with a penis. But then this really cool rock star comes and says, hey, love is love. And then he realized that's right. And then he and that awesome woman go and fight some zombie aliens. It looks like a cool movie. Wish I could find it. Buddy Boy. We have Sal, who is a trans woman. I would say this character is a trans woman. And she's played by Susan Terrell, who's an interesting woman. Butcher Baker, Nightmare Maker, am I right? And yeah, she ends up kind of forming an attachment to this like really gross dude, and he finds out that she was assigned male at birth, and then kind of gets into a not good situation. So then Sal ends up beating him to death with her prosthetic leg, and that's a lot going on in that movie. Cannibalism, maybe, hallucinations, voyeurism. It is also, I would say, very relatable to Psycho, but in a 90s gritty indie way. I love that movie. I really don't know how to talk about it though. It's a strange film. Soapdish. Montana Moorhead is played by Kathy Moriarty. Oh, God. This is a movie that I really liked until you got to like, oh, Montana Moorhead is a trans woman and she's publicly outed, and it's not necessary, simply unnecessary. And again, it's like with the Ace Ventura and the Crying Game thing, you have the trope of the vomiting after you learn you've kissed a trans woman. The dead naming is a lot. Oh my God. The public outing to win. Yeah, the trans person is a villain for no reason. Ridiculous. I'm gonna throw in Seed of Chucky for Glenn Glenda. But I love this because Glenn Glenda is like a very sweet little character. We love Glenn Glenda, and they're kind of the victim. They do kind of develop mental illness, but that's not because of their identity. That's because their parents really messed them up. Like if Chucky, oh my God, I can't think of her name. And Chucky and Tiffany were your parents, you'd be messed up too. It's just a matter of time. But now I get to my tangent on Ed Wood. You know what? We gotta take a sip of our Scooby coffee. So I thought, really, when I watched Ed Wood, the Tim Burton movie, to be clear, I don't like Tim Burton, but when I saw what's-his-name's performance, like, I actually thought that's what Ed Wood was like, and I think it's because I've seen Plan 9. But then I watched Glenn Glenda, and I saw the actual Ed Wood, and I'm like, oh, that's not right at all. And I see, like, this is what happens when you have a guy who is constantly talking about being different, but is really a cishet white middle-class dude from freaking Burbank who has only ever had success, or if they failed very much up. Where is he different in any respect? Is he even neurodivergent? Like, where is he any different? Like, he was just bullied as a kid, and not to take away from that. That can be very traumatizing. But, like, girl, you're so successful, shut up. And we need to pick someone who actually is other, someone who is truly different, and who could not even legally be themselves. He does it in a way that comes off as so mocking. And I do not like Tim Burton. All that to say, hey, watch Glenn Glenda. And you see someone who was making a movie in the Hays Code era, who is honestly supposed to be an exploitation film about this, like the first like really public trans woman who had like a sexual assignment surgery. And you see this person kind of working through their identity in an era where they literally didn't have the language or the lens to even really do so in any like deep or introspective way, or well, only through like a negative catharsis. That is to say, like, hey, this isn't okay. It's illegal and wrong, but it makes me happy. I love that. Dr. Jekyll, Sister Hyde, which I think is probably the best of all of these movies in terms of like the representation it's depicting. It also Jack the Ripper, which is not the first time I've seen that. I've seen that in a Anthony Perkins film, Edge of Sanity, wherein he plays Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, who also is Jack the Ripper. I don't know why those are always combined so frequently, but it is. The key to the formula for a long life is estrogen, which is very similar to Frankenhooker. Love that movie. Oh, Head and Lauder. And in this case, when Dr. Jekyll transforms, they become a woman, Hyde. And more than that, the transformation is not shown as monstrous, but euphoric. Body transformations are oftentimes have a trans read, but are often shown as monstrous, like werewolves, for instance. But this is shown, or any Cronenberg movie, this is shown as euphoric. At first, Jekyll is the killer, and ultimately Jekyll will be our final killer. Hyde becomes a killer slightly, just so that they can remain a woman. And it's shown as kind of sympathetic. She just wants ownership and integrity, and it's kind of cool. She's not the final killer. Jekyll is, or tries to be, and they do unfortunately have a gender death in that Jekyll is climbing a wall and transforms into Hyde, who doesn't have the upper body strength that Jekyll is, and falls to their death and they're kind of like part through the shifts, so they're kind of androgynous at that point. And it's unintentionally kind of progressive. Like, I really like it. Way to go, them. Hammer Horror, doing your 70s exploitation nonsense, but you made a kind of cool movie. Like, way to go. I kind of want to mention, I know I said I was trying to like stay away from like stuff where it's like body swapping or supernatural, like Incubus, Freaky, Deathspa, but Deathspa. Ghost possession movie, David and his twin sister, Catherine. So Catherine is dead and she's kind of possessing David, who is dressing up like Catherine. And honestly, this movie is so nonsensical, I kind of couldn't tell. I think David was dressed as Catherine. And the cops think we have, a cross-dressing serial killer. So I guess it is unintentionally does fall into this trope. But it's so strange, I really can't define it any further. And I honestly just want more people to watch it, which is why I'm bringing it up now. I kind of just needed to talk about Psycho Beach Party for a unique version of The Man in the Dress that's kind of progressive. It is a 2000 movie, kind of in the vein of A Cherry Falls, in that it's kind of like genre deconstruction. There's a killer who is killing people who are different. One might go so far as to say other. They kill a girl in a wheelchair, a girl who is sans a body part, a guy who has psoriasis. I don't know. But there is a girl with DID. She is not the killer. She's almost a victim. Oh my god, it's almost like it can be done. The police officer investigating the crime is a man in drag. He's clearly meant in the context of the film to be assigned female at birth. But that person is the creator of the screenplay, because it's based off a play, as well as the film. And many of these roles are originally played by guys in drag, kind of similar to like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I really love this. And it's not played for a laugh, and it's not played to be Uncanny Valley. He just wanted to write himself into the movie. Like, yeah, you deserve it. You wrote it. And there are some instances where men are cast to play women, as I said earlier, to be like visually uncanny, like in Pet Sematary and in Black Christmas, but that is not this at all. The serial killer ends up being a cishet white dude killing people who are other, which is the most realistic of all the movies I mentioned. It's a hate crime. This movie is about hate crime. He's killing, like people who are differently abled and stuff, but it's like, yeah, that's it. That's real. That's the realistic thing. This is it. This dumb movie, which I actually really love, is the most realistic of all of these. And I just want to lastly talk about a movie I saw as a kid that I actually really legitimately thought fit into this, and realized in rewatch, which I've seen a number of times, but the most recent rewatch in looking at it through this lens, I actually don't think it does now. It's called In Dreams, with Robert Downey Jr. plays this mentally ill character Vivian, who is extremely abused. And maybe it's because their name is Vivian that I thought this, if I'm being honest. But I really thought they were supposed to be playing a effeminate character, however they identify, like someone who was abused and, was supposed to be a girl, but is played by a guy in some way. I wasn't really sure. And I went in and watched, I'm like, no, I think this is actually just supposed to be a cis guy. And I was just completely incorrect and confused. But the fact that I came away with that, I think, is what is important, because that's really the big issue. I said it before, but I really think it bears repeating. Who are we willing to see as the victim, and who do we see as the monster? Who are we willing to demonize and villainize regardless of their behavior, but just for existing? To pull a quote from A Timeline of Transgender Horror by Logan Ashley Kisner, the idea that a person is too mentally unstable to know themselves is an argument used against transgender people and other LGBT people continually. Mental illness does not negate a person's transness, and yet it is a talking point brought up constantly to try and convince others that trans people don't actually know what they're talking about. These films framed transness as stemming from abuse, or men hating mothers, and even dissociative identity disorder, which none of these are true. It reinforces negative stereotypes. It's a trope that is used for shock value and shock value alone. Movie makers want to distance themselves from trans identity, but in doing so, they are removing the autonomy and identity, the voice, from these people. Doctors diagnose and analyze them. They are rarely able to define themselves, and when they do, their identity is continually denied by said doctors and police and so on and so forth. The The film industry is perpetuating transphobic misinformation. It's working as a propaganda machine for capitalism, profiting off fear of other, and a desire to maintain normative gender roles, to maintain the status quo and distance themselves from their responsibility in creating a villain who does simply not exist. Again, to quote Timeline of Transgender Horror by Logan Ashley Kisner, most notable thing about this list is a lack of evolution. It feels rare to say that a film made in 1930 has nearly identical politics to a film made in 1991 or 2012, and yet it's hard to discern any real difference between the way transgender people are depicted throughout this list. Gender is nearly always a twist, a last-minute shocker meant to solidify the film in your mind. Absolutely true. There's a conversation I hear a lot about, this movie couldn't be made today. Clearly, these movies are being made today. It's that these movies shouldn't be made today. That is the key word. And it's less and less. And now I think it's been a few years since I've seen anything like this, with the last one being Insidious Chapter 2, which people don't really talk about and note the issue with it, which I find to be very worrisome. These movies shouldn't be made today because we should have evolved and seen that that is not okay, that it is a backwards thinking, it is not true, and it is causing real world harm. And we can see that with all of the transphobia, with how many people have been killed, particularly trans women of color, with all these laws that are, trying to deny people healthcare, to deny their identity, to make identity illegal. And that is wrong. And, these people are being hurt. Trans people are being hurt. And so again, it's okay to like these movies, but just know what these movies are doing and the problem that they are causing and how they are not, please, if anything, this is not an accurate reflection of the real world. I'll leave you with trans people are 4 times more likely to be the victim of violent crimes. It's very rare they're the perpetrator. Okay? Do better. Do better.